It is time to start, and I would like to welcome everyone to this EBA mini-seminar, Measuring the Effects of Development Assistance, Impact on Democracy, that we're organizing as a part of the GEI Global Evaluation Week. And today we'll discuss how to measure impacts of development cooperation with democracy as the example. My name is Lisa Hjelm, and I'm a program manager at the Expert Group for Aid Studies. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Expert Group for Aid Studies, or EBA, it is a government committee with the mandate to evaluate and analyze Swedish development cooperation with the aim to contribute to an efficient implementation of aid. Early this year, we launched a report called Effects of Swedish and International Democracy Aid, authored by researchers from UNU Wider. The study was led by Miguel Niño Sarasua, who is a development economist and a non-resident senior research fellow at UNU Wider, who will also present what they did in this study in this mini seminar. And after the presentation, we'll also invite Elina Scheyer from SIDA and Jan Pettersson from EBA to have a discussion around the possibilities with quantitative methods to measure impact in development evaluation. We would also like to involve all of you in the conversation. So if you have any questions or reflections that you would like to be brought up in the discussion, please enter them in the chat function. And with that, I hand over to Miguel from UNU Wider for the presentation.
Thank you, Lisa. So let me just share my my screen. Just give me a second. Oh. Right. Just let me. Okay. So do you see?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So well, thank you very much. It is my pleasure to be in this EBA seminar. I will be discussing the results of this study, but in particular, I will be focusing on the methods that underpin the analysis. So this study was conducted with my colleagues at Wider. So and I will just focusing on the questions that we try to address. So, and the reason why we conducted this study is because there are concerns about the trends of democracy in recent years. So the study asks the following questions. So does democracy aid work? How? And under what conditions it may work better? So the study conducted a new systematic review on the existing literature and a new international comparative analysis covering 148 countries during a period of 1995 to 2018. So in this study, I will focus on the international comparative analysis. And in the discussion, we can also discuss about other components of the study. So, well, just briefly to give you an overview of our findings is that the results indicate a modest but positive contribution of international and Swedish democracy aid to democracy. So the effects are stronger when democracy aid targets core pro-democratic activities such as civil society, the free media, and human rights. Importantly, we don't find any negative effect of international or Swedish democracy aid on democracy. So both international and Swedish democracy aid seems to be more effective at supporting democratization than at halting democratic backsliding. So, and in one of the things that I think is very important to say is that the international comparative analysis relies on a theoretical framework that tries to explain the channels and mechanisms that predict the relationship between aid and democracy. So overall, we address three key questions in this study. So the first one is, does democracy and developmental aid contribute to democracy? The second question is, does democracy aid support democratization or upturns or help avoid democratic backsliding? And the third question is democracy or developmental aid more effective at supporting democratization in democracies or autocracies? So before going into the methods, I think it's very important to tell you how we measure democracy aid in the first place. So in this study, we focus on 3 composite democratic aid measures using the OECD the creditor reporting system database, which contains information about aid allocation. So we adopted 3 definitions in the first place. So the first one is what we refer to as developmental aid, that measures the sum of total aid allocated to sectors and activities. And this definition has been traditionally used in the literature. More recently, some studies have been using a measure of democracy aid, what we define as an extensive definition, which consists of a set of activities that support government and civil society organizations. No? Now, when we started to look at these definitions, we realized that these measures suffer from imprecision, and it also includes other activities that are not really meant to strengthen democracy, such as aid to meteorological services. So therefore, we adopted a third definition of democracy, which we call limited definition, that measures a set of activities that support key dimensions of democracy, such as, for example, as the support to democratic participation in the civil society, elections, the free media, and human rights. We also look at lower level indices or activities that aid normally support, and those activities were aimed to link to specific subcomponents of democracy indices. Well, this is just to show you the recent trends of democracy aid or developmental aid by a group of donors over time. And what we can see is that Sweden has been by far the country that provides the largest share of aid to support democracy in OECD countries. Now, the next question is how we measure democracy. And this is also very important because democracy is a very complex concept. So in this study, we rely on a set of indices from the Varieties of Democracy project. And our choice is based on a rigorous analysis of democracy indices that I will discuss briefly in a few minutes. So we rely on this index, which is an interval index on a scale between 0 and 1, because it offers also subcomponents that can be also used in a more decomposable way. So we can link specific activities to these lower level indices of democracy. So just to give you an example, in this table, you see, for example, aid to support democratic participation and civil society can also be linked to the freedom of association index of the VDEM index. So the analysis of democracy index consists of 2 components. The first one was a conceptual analysis and a statistical analysis. So we look at several indices or sources of information about democracy, like the Freedom House, the Polity4, the ICRG data, and including the VDEM. So we compare all these sources of information and arrive to the conclusion that the VDEM was the main or the best source of information for the analysis. So on the conceptual level, we conducted this analysis based on 6 criteria. The first one is definition. So it is an important aspect, or probably the most important aspect. So because an index of democracy is suitable for analysis when ideally is based on a broad, multidimensional, and also a decomposable definition given the various dimensions of democracy. So, so the multi-purpose nature of activities supported by aid would be also connected to these dimensions. The second criteria was precision. So how sensitive these indices are to different gradations in the degree of quality of democracy. So it is very important because since foreign aid in general really is very small in terms of size compared to countries' GDP, we can expect that democracy aid is having a very marginal effect on democracy outcomes. So therefore, it's very important to look at how these indices move and to identify indices that also are able to capture these small changes in democratic achievement. So the precision was very important. Then obviously coverage and source of information was a key area. So we wanted to cover as many years as possible and also as many countries as possible. We look at coding in terms of assessing how the threats of to coding subjectivity are minimized in the collection of data. We also look at aggregation and disaggregation, which is also in particular important for this study because we wanted to look at this relationship between specific activities and lower levels indices of democracy. And also we look at intercoding validity and reliability tests that are conducted in this repository. So we look at all these factors. On a statistical basis, we conducted several analyses on historical trends. We also look at point estimates to assess the discrepancies in democratic indices, and also conducted a reliability and internal validity analysis of indices based on convergent and divergent validities, which, just to give you an example, so convergent validity measures or tests whether an item of the index, of the democracy index, is sufficiently correlated with the score calculated with the items of the same dimension, while divergence validity tests whether an item of this index is poorly correlated with the scores computed in other dimensions. No? So that gives you a sense of how valid and strongly these indices are. So our analysis shows that about 90% of the VDEM's lower levels of indices pass the convergence validity test and 95% pass the divergence validity test. So in fact, most of these, the indices were well performed in statistical terms. But the main issue for us was the availability of fully disaggregated data. No? So for that reason, we decided to use VDEM. And in the report, we present a very extensive analysis and discussion on these choices. Now, we also use other data sources because the theories of democracy also highlight specific determinants that can be strong predictors of democracy. So we resorted to different data sources in the analysis, and these are a number of data sources and also variables that we use in the analysis. So now, going to the first question, how does democracy or developmental aid contribute to democracy? So what we did, and we really spent a lot of time thinking about this because we were faced with a number of issues. So first of all, we suspected like trend effects in democratic achievements. And also we suspected that the decisions by donors to allocate aid is to be influenced by previous levels of democracy, you know? So which is in a way the normal story of reverse causality. So in this case, the best choice was to adopt a dynamic framework, you know? A dynamic framework that in a way captures these dynamic relationships while controlling for example, unobserved factors at the country level. That's why we implemented a fixed effect, which is this eta parameter that you can see here. And we enter democracy in lag because that really captures these dynamics in the relationship between democracy and aid that we were discussing before. So one of the important things is that this particular framework allows for feedback effects from lag democracies to the contemporaneous levels of aid allocation. So this is very important. No? So one of the things also we include this X, this is a vector that in a way put together a number of things that theorists normally argue are important for democracy. No? So this is a country level determinants. And I will give you also as follows a number of controls that we included in these estimates. So we included several functional forms, in particular two ones, one linear and one linear log specification that in a way captures the absolute change in the electoral democracy indices associated with 1% change in democracy aid allocated to those countries. And also we included a log-log specification, which in a way smooths the relationship between these two sources and also allows to measure the elasticities. In other words, how responsive democracy is to the interventions of donors. So just to give you a quick description of what we included in these models, we have 4 models that included a number of things that theorists include. So just let me give you a description of model 1, which is what I will present later on throughout the presentation. But we also run 4 different models that capture different things. But in first model include the rate of economic growth that measures the dynamism of the economy in those countries that receive aid. Also the log of income per capita lagged 1 period to measure the stock of physical capital, and also to capture the rate of economic convergence in these countries. We also include the share of the urban population that captures the level of urbanization, and the structural theories of democracy highlights this factor as an important predictor. Also, we include population density measured as the number of people per square kilometer of land area, and also the availability of natural resource endowments, because we also know that natural resource rich countries also have, the incumbents have strong incentives to remain in power, no? So there's these dynamics between these factors and democracy. So we include many other factors as well in complementary models. So, so this kind of dynamic panel models usually, or in the past, has been estimated using system generalized methods of momentum or moments. And well, the system GMM relies on an identifying assumption that requires that the variables in the model observe a mean stationary process, which is very difficult to satisfy in this kind of studies that we have. No? So what we did after thinking very carefully about the options that we had, we implemented a maximum likelihood estimation and a structural equation model, which sounds very complicated, and it is a bit complicated. But one of the benefits of these models is that relaxes several constraints that the system GMM has, and also is more effective, and unlike other fixed effects methods that are out there, also allows for the inclusion of time invariant control. So that was a very important aspect. And also this particular model has proved to be much more reliable than previous approaches to deal with these kind of problems in a dynamic framework. Now, the problem with this model is that it's computationally very demanding. So our choice at some point came at the cost of convergence issues, no? So we were struggling to estimate some of the variance of these models. So therefore, we also conducted additional estimators, like fixed effects estimators, with different specifications. One, entering democracy aid lagged 1 period to precisely mitigate the effect of the causality that is related to these relationships. And also, we enter aid in per capita terms to account for the effects of aid and to control for the size of the population in those recipient countries. So despite of the problems with the system GMM, we also implemented the system GMM and first difference GMMs, but in combination of exogenous instruments. And maybe if we have time later on, I can talk more about the external instruments. And all these models found similar results, no? In the magnitude, in a very different, in a different magnitude, but all of them pointed to a positive and significant effect of aid on democracy. So what we find is that the contribution of international and Swedish democracy aid.
Miguel, you have 5 more minutes.
All right, okay, thanks. It's positive and it's statistically significant. So overall, a 10% increase in international democracy aid using the limited definition that we observe over a 5-year period is associated with an average 0.14 point increase in the scalar of democracy aid. So this is based on the LMSM model using the model 1 that I described. No? So I will skip the implications of how we interpret those results, and we can go back to this point later on. But I want to show you or focus on the methods that we implemented. So on the second question, does democracy aid support democratization, upturns, or help avoid democratic backsliding? So that was a very important question because we wanted to know whether aid is more effective at supporting democratization or really dealing with the backsliding that we observe nowadays around the world. So we adopted this particular framework that, in a way, the democracy aid takes the form of 2 indicators. We transform these indicators to capture instances of positive or negative changes in the dividend electoral democracy index. So by taking the first difference of the index and setting all the cases of no change or negative or positive values to 0, no? So in the end, we end up with a sensor distribution, no? Because we have a lot of zeros and positive values. So what people have done in the past is to use least squares. But the problem is with this kind of approaches is that least squares will be biased and inconsistent. So therefore, we use a semi-parametric method, which is, you know, there are no parametric methods to use fixed effect Tobit estimator. So we have to resort to these more complicated semi-parametric methods. But nevertheless, the results were very encouraging. So we find that democracy is more effective at supporting upturns than downturns. So and this is consistent either in using contemporaneous or past democracy aid. No, so it was very consistent. So I will explain the interpretation of these results if you want later on, but I will skip that just to move on to the next question that we ask and the way we answer this question. So we wanted to model whether aid was more effective among democratizing regimes that were either democracies already or autocracies. So in order to do that, what we did is we follow the typology that Luhrmann has adopted that separates political regimes in 4 categories, like closed autocracies, electoral autocracies, electoral democracies, and liberal democracies. So because we have a situation of ordinal data, we adopted that these fixed order logic estimators. No? So in a way, this allows you to estimate the extent to which democracy aid affects democracy in these particular countries that are within these particular definitions or classifications. Now, what we find is a small and again positive effects of democracy aid. So a 10% annual increase in international democracy aid is associated with a 22% increase in the probability of electoral democracies to remain in that particular regime type, and also reduces the probability of a closed autocracies or electoral autocracies to remain in that regime, which is positive because reduces the the probability of remaining autocratic, but the effect is much more smaller for closed autocracies. No? So what we find is that essentially aid is more effective at supporting democracies or closed electoral democracies that are moving towards becoming an electoral democracy. Also, we also find that the results are consistent only when we control, for example, for this fiscal space of countries, the level of state fragility, the presence of ethnic tensions and income inequality. So all these factors seems to be very important in taking into account when aid becomes significant. No, so just to conclude very quickly. So overall, the study really finds a strong evidence that aid is effective and in supporting democracy as a political system around the world. So the contribution is strong when aid targets the core dimensions of democracy, like civil society, free media, and human rights. Importantly, and I think this is a very important thing, is that we don't find any negative effect of aid as previous studies have suggested. So we don't find any evidence of that. No? So the pressing question is how to respond to backsliding countries, especially when those with the most pronounced losses in democratic freedoms are among middle-income countries that normally now are experiencing considerable cuts in aid. And also an implicit interpretation of the results is that cutting aid prematurely, in particular in countries that have not achieved democratic consolidation, could adversely the impact of the state of democracy worldwide. So I think that the evidence really support the arguments to continue supporting democracy aid, and also increasing in certain areas where we observe and we report in the study that aid has been declining or not supporting sufficiently. And the counterfactual of not doing that is basically what we can observe in certain countries. No, so the state of democracy has been on the decline, and obviously there may be some major consequences in terms of international peace, stability, and prosperity. So the evidence points to the need for active involvement. You know? So, and I'm happy to maybe, I think is within 20 minutes, yeah. So maybe we can discuss in more detail the specific areas of the methods and also the implications of the results. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Miguel. And that leads us into the questions that you're posing as well, and what you're saying about what the evidence supports and how we can interpret these findings. And I would like to welcome also our panelists that we have with us. Elina Scheja, who is a lead economist at the Chief Economist team of the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, SIDA, and Jan Pettersson, who is the Managing Director at the Expert Group for Aid Studies. And I would like to start the discussion. First, I would like to say, remind everyone that if you have any questions or reflections that you would like to share, you can type them in the chat function. And you can also indicate if you would like to pose a question live there, and we can make sure that to make that happen as well. But first, I would like to start with a question for Jan, and that is, since you're the managing director at EBA, I would like to ask you, why did EBA decide to commission this study? Who is it for, and how can it be used within the Swedish Development Corporation?
Thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you, Miguel, for the presentation. Yeah, those of you familiar with EBA, you will know that this is not a typical EBA study that we publish. Still, we think that it has an important and a natural place in our portfolio. We identify and we think there is a demand among the general public in the political sphere and elsewhere for to evaluate impact of aid of development cooperation at a level higher than individual interventions. And this is to some extent an answer to a call from the Agency for Public Management, the Statskontoret, some years ago, that asked for more evaluations, taking a longer term perspective to evaluate the value added of Swedish development cooperation. And it's true that such attempts are not often performed, and when they're done, they're normally done within academia as research papers. And I think that or at least one of the reasons for the scarcity of these types of evaluations is that we in evaluation offices tend not to see it as prioritized. We don't see how it fits into the everyday business, to the timing of the strategies at hand, and so on. So we fail to some extent to identify intended users for these types of studies. And this is where I think that we at the evaluation offices, not only in Sweden but elsewhere globally, I think we sometimes have a too narrow understanding of intended users, and maybe that we overly focus on the instrumental use of evaluations. So, and I think this is how we should think about this study. I think we should think of the use as conceptual. It's about frame of reference, it to some extent of in terms of enlightenment, if you like, aiming at broad learning for at the collective level. And this, of course, assumes a broad demand for these types of studies, and it also requires us to have a dissemination that is able to match that demand. And thinking about the use and for whom this study then would be useful, I think there are a wide audience. One example, a specific example, would be individual program officers at, for example, SIDA. And I think it is of great value for individuals working with a specific intervention to know whether the success or failure they observe in their program or intervention is a part of a general pattern or not. I think that is quite important. And more generally, I think that the aid sector as such needs to be better at more systematically trying to provide answers to general answers to general questions, and also be, to some extent, I would say, to be precise on what type of questions that can fruitfully be answered. I think the most common question posed is, does aid work? And I think we have I think we need to explain why that is not a fruitful question to pose, and why that is to some extent impossible to answer more than better than you think, worse than you hope for. But also to answer those questions that are general, that can be answered, of the type, does democracy aid really leads to improvement of individual countries' democracy indexes? So this is the type of question that is being answered in this study, and I think it has great value. I think I'll stop there. I have something to say about use and misunderstandings and so on, but in order to have some time for discussion, thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. Yes, and that's. I would like to hear maybe something similar from Elina, so from your SIDA perspective, and what are the advantages to be able to say that something at the global level, like this study, what are the advantages to say, to have this information, to know if it does or doesn't make a difference? And how can this information then be used by practitioners and policymakers?
Thanks. It's a great question. First of all, thank you very much for having me in this discussion. It's right at the heart of what we're talking about at SIDA at the moment. So it's a very, very well timed. I would like to say that this is a very great contribution. I think it has great value for the general policy discussion, and also for the broader strategic priorities for development cooperation. I think the practitioners who work with democracy aid tend to think that democracy works, but still this question pops up in the public debate on regular basis. We have used quite a lot of country case studies, qualitative evidence that it works, but that's always subject to criticism that that's anecdotal, that doesn't provide the broad picture. So having a complementary view that shows results across countries over time and arrives to the conclusion that it works is a great complement to other type of evidence that we can use. And at the moment, SIDA is in its operational plan. We have a goal that says that we adapt our ways of working based on experience from evaluations, science, and other evidence. And I think this is a great contribution to this discussion. But to kind of possibly problematize it a little bit, and to back to Jan's argument on how useful that is for program officers, in order for it to be actionable, saying that it works on average at a global level is not very actionable if you're already working in this area. So posing questions, and what was it that made it work? What works better than others? What is it that works within democracy aid is something that we need to dig deeper into. And we didn't get into the nitty-gritties, but I know the study includes some answers to that question as well. So I think the granularity is what makes the operational importance, whereas the overall impact is what makes it important for the public debate. Thanks.
Thanks, Elina. And it's right that it was a challenging task for Miguel to present everything that they did regarding the methodology in just 20 minutes. So, and I also liked that he mentioned that it is a bit complicated. And this was, of course, a light touch of the methodology. But I want to bring up a question that we have in the Q&A. Miguel, if you can explain a little bit more this issue that it's not just if democracy aid is just not working and not actually worsening the situation. There was, for example, in the second model, it showed a negative value for backfall of democracy development. I wonder if you can say maybe something about this issue that came up.
Yes, well, thank you very much for the person who made the question. So, well, I guess the second model, maybe he means the second question, no, about the upturns and downturns, which is what I understand. So, well, in a way, what the graphic shows is the spikes crossing to the left of the line that reaches the value of 0, which suggests that the relationship may be negative. But as you can see in this particular chart, is that the spikes don't really cross the line at 0, which means that there is no confidence interval, so no certainty that the effect is actually negative. There is indications that in countries that are experiencing downturns, aid may have or may not have a negative effect, but we don't have the robust evidence, and we didn't find any evidence for that. Obviously, and going back to the point that Eline and Jan were mentioning, that in this kind of studies, you put together 148 countries over 25 years period. So what you have here is a number of point estimates converging to the mean. No? So you have, imagine, there are multiple points over time, and then they start to put together in a single figure or a single picture that tries to explain what is happening. So obviously that mean, this average, doesn't necessarily reflect what may happen in certain countries, no? And obviously aid may, in certain conditions or under certain characteristics, may have either insignificant or possibly negative effects, but we don't find evidence for that, no? So, so this is what I can say. So what we have strong evidence is that aid has a significant effect on upturns. In other words, countries that are in the process of democratizing, no? And well, these questions are very difficult to address on a country level basis unless you have data at subnational level, no? And you have micro data, you really want to do something rigorously at national level. Otherwise, it's very hard to really claim any strong external validity of the studies that you may want to conduct, no? So these international studies are complex and also challenging, no? Very challenging in terms of really unpacking the mechanisms and also finding precise estimates by country level. But also the analysis allows you to look at countries that may be close to certain turning points, no? As I said, you have an estimate, a parameter that you can actually see at which point each country that received aid is, and you can see whether the likelihood of, for example, giving money to, I don't want to name countries, but certain countries that are very close to crossing the democratic ladder, most likely is going to be more effective than countries that are really at the bottom of the distribution of the democratic score, no? Because it's going to be really hard to, that aid with very small and you know, modest contributions that they make, it's going to be very difficult to mitigate the effect that these autocratic regimes have in the country, no? It's going to be very difficult unless something happens, no? And we are looking just at aid, by the way. So we are not looking at other kind of interventions that donors can use, for example, no? Like foreign policy strategies or military aid and all those kind of things. So we are not looking at that, no? It's just purely aid.
Thanks. Thank you, Miguel. I want to pick up on something that Elina said in her comment, that often it is known qualitatively what is working and what is not at the country level, and this type of study can be a good complement. But my question is, or what I wonder is, are there any risks with this type of higher level information that it's misinterpreted? Any challenges or risks related to that? Elina, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, thanks. I think, like any studies, this need to be put in a context and understand what is the question that the study is answering, and what is the question it's not answering. And saying that something works on average doesn't mean that it works every time. So drawing those conclusions to the other side would be detrimental. But I don't think that risk is, I mean, it's a theoretical risk, but I don't see that being, it's more of an empirical question. And I think people are drawing the right conclusions for it. So that's an hypothesis that we have that has support at the global level. But of course, we need to put things into the right context and understand the contextual limitations to it.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. I want to build on the thought that this type of evidence at the global level can be useful in some circumstances. But I want to ask Miguel, like in this, what made it feasible to conduct this study? What was this a unique opportunity to look at aid and democracy? What were the sort of data requirements, and would it be possible to do these type of studies also in other fields, thinking of education, health, or is democracy special, or do you think it could be possible also in other thematic areas?
Well, yes, thank you very much for the question, Lisa. Well, in a way, we are fortunate nowadays, because when I started to do this kind of research 10 years ago, the data was not as good as it is today. It's not perfect, but it's far better, no? Especially from certain countries. Also, the methods that we use, either econometric or can be experimental or quasi-experimental, and also qualitative methods have improved substantially, no? So I think what made possible this particular analysis was the availability of data. No, VDEM, for example, is a project that started not very long time ago. No, it hasn't been around 20 years around. So these are really massive efforts to collect data that can be used for this kind of studies. And also on the more technical aspect, you know, computationally, I haven't talked about this, but the methods that we implemented are computationally really demanding. No, so it was 10 years ago. Computers were not having the capacity to run the models that we run today. No, so this is another thing that is helping us as researchers to investigate key questions. Although it's not perfect, as I was saying, that even nowadays, Stata, which we use Stata, no? Stata is a software that helps you to do this kind of analysis. And this software was crashing and having a lot of problems to run these models. So whereas we have made substantial progress, there is still a lot of work to do in these areas. Also, data is quite imperfect, no? Especially in certain domains, data remains short or having a lot of measurement error. So there is a need for improving the capacity of data collection. But certainly, I think that there have been progress to implement these studies, and also in other areas. Certainly, in particular, the effect of aid on the social sector, for example, we have sufficient data to look at this. And also, I think that there are many other questions that I think can better be addressed by looking at the dynamics within countries. But then we need data for that, no? So, and data is being one of the main problems in conducting these kind of studies. But what made possible was, you know, better data, better methods, and more computational capacity, no, overall. But still, there is some way to go. No?
So maybe that's an area where we can hope there will continue to be improvements in better data, better methods, and better computational programs and softwares as well. We are out of time for this mini seminar, and I would like to thank all of you for participating, thank our panelists, and thanks to Miguel for the presentation, and thank you to those of you attending this mini seminar. And I would also like to say that if you're interested to know more about this report, you can find it on our website, eba.se. There you can read in the main report, and we also have some technical annexes for those of you who want to dig in the methods. And at our website, you can also register for our newsletter if you're interested in more of this type of seminars, events, and also reports, of course. So with that, I would like to say thank you to all of you.